A 14-year-old girl lies on the frozen doorstep of her own home on a bitter winter night, unconscious and barely clothed. Her hair is frozen to the ground, and her life has just changed forever. This is a story about justice, or perhaps about the justice that never came. Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Alex, and you're watching Who Was. Today we're going to talk about a story that begins in a small American town, but whose impact runs so deep that it shook an entire nation. This is the story of Daisy Coleman, a girl who, in her short life, endured shock after shock, and whose fate is so heartbreaking that it will leave anyone who hears it stunned. In this video, we'll walk through everything from beginning to end, in detail, looking at how one single night changed the destiny of an entire family. If you love true stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because today's story will shake you to your core. Let's begin. The Coleman family lived in a small town called Albany, Missouri. It was a home filled with laughter and warmth. Michael Coleman was a surgeon, and his wife Melinda was a veterinarian. Both were well respected in their profession, and their house was always full of life, echoing with the voices of guests and children. They had 4 children, 3 sons, Charlie, Tristan, and Logan, and 1 daughter, Daisy. Daisy was the only girl in the family, and naturally, everyone's darling. This family wasn't just an ordinary household. It was a complete, joyful unit where everyone was a sports fan, cheering for local teams and spending weekends together. No one could have imagined that this happiness would soon turn into tragedy. It was 2009, and Daisy was only 12 years old. One day, her father Michael and her older brother were driving her to a neighboring town to watch a football game. The weather was bad, the road was wet, and the car skidded, colliding head-on with an oncoming vehicle. In this accident, Michael Coleman died on the spot. The children, fortunately, weren't seriously hurt, but they had lost their father forever. This shock was unbearable for the family. A house that once echoed with laughter suddenly fell silent. Melinda decided to move away from the city with her children, so the old memories wouldn't haunt them at every turn. Eventually, they made Maryville, Missouri their new home, where the children enrolled in a new school and Melinda began working at a veterinary center. As time passed, the family slowly began to heal. Daisy gradually started coming out of the grief of her father's death. She took up dance and gymnastics, and also became part of the school cheerleading team. She had another gift too. She drew beautiful sketches and dreamed of becoming an artist or a designer when she grew up. At school, Daisy's personality won everyone's heart. People called her bright, open-hearted, and cheerful. Her closest friend was Paige. The two were so close that everyone called them inseparable. They went to school together, were on the cheerleading team together, attended the same dance studio, and often spent the night at each other's houses. No one saw any danger in this friendship. But fate had another trial written for this family, and this time, that trial would be so horrifying that it would spark outrage across all of America. Let's move to the night when everything changed. It was the night of January 7th, 2012. School was on winter break, and Paige, as usual, was staying over at Daisy's house. The two friends were watching movies, eating sweets, and chatting, just like any ordinary teenage night. But once everyone else in the house had gone to sleep, the two girls made a decision that would change their lives forever. Daisy quietly slipped into the family's wine cabinet and took a bottle of liquor. After midnight, she and her friend Paige shared a few drinks together. As the alcohol affected them, Daisy started texting 17-year-old Matthew Barnett, a popular student and promising soccer player who was also a friend of her older brother. When Matthew learned the girls were home alone, he invited them to a small gathering at his house, assuring them that no adults were around. Excited by the invitation, Daisy and Paige quietly climbed out through the bedroom window and were picked up by Matthew and one of his friends. When they arrived, several teenagers were already gathered in the basement, where the girls were offered more drinks. Matthew repeatedly encouraged Daisy to keep drinking, and before long she became heavily intoxicated. Paige noticed her friend was in no condition to look after herself and tried to check on her several times. Later, when Paige went searching for Daisy, she realized her friend had been separated from the rest of the group and was in a highly vulnerable state. According to later investigations, Daisy was unable to give consent, and several individuals at the party took advantage of her condition, while one attendee reportedly recorded what happened on a phone. The events of that night would later become a major focus of the criminal investigation. As the gathering ended, the boys drove Daisy and Paige back to Daisy's house. Paige had begun to sober up, but Daisy was still barely responsive and needed help getting out of the car. The boys assured Paige they would stay with Daisy until she recovered enough to go inside safely, so Paige quietly climbed back into the house and soon fell asleep. Instead of helping Daisy, they left her outside alone in the freezing temperatures of a January night. She remained there for hours until she slowly regained awareness, unable to properly feel her arms or legs because of the extreme cold. That heartbreaking decision had devastating consequences and became one of the most shocking and tragic parts of the entire case. With great effort, Daisy managed to lift her head and look around before slowly dragging herself, inch by inch, toward the front door of her own home. It was a heartbreaking sight. A 14-year-old girl, alone in the freezing cold, struggling with every bit of strength she had just to reach safety. When she finally reached the door, she began knocking as hard as she could. Inside, her mother Melinda was asleep and initially assumed it was the family dog trying to get back inside. But the moment she opened the door, she was met with a scene no parent should ever have to witness. Daisy was lying on the doorstep, barely responsive, without shoes or a jacket, shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Melinda immediately called for her sons, and together they carried Daisy inside the house. Wearing only a thin t-shirt and lightweight pants, Daisy was suffering from severe exposure to the freezing temperatures. She could barely speak and was crying while the strong smell of alcohol filled the room. Drawing on her medical training, Melinda realized blankets alone would not be enough. She instructed her sons to help carry Daisy into the bathtub, where she carefully began warming her body with warm, not hot, water to avoid causing further injury from the cold. As she helped her daughter, Melinda noticed injuries and bruising that immediately told her something deeply disturbing had happened. Fearing the worst, she called both the police and paramedics without hesitation. Until emergency responders arrived, she stayed beside Daisy, doing everything she could to keep her warm while desperately trying to remain calm. At the hospital, doctors found Daisy's condition extremely serious. Her blood alcohol level was dangerously high, and medical examinations documented injuries that investigators later considered significant evidence in the case. Because Daisy had little memory of what had happened that night, she was unable to clearly explain the events leading up to her condition. That morning marked the beginning of a long and painful journey, not only toward physical recovery, but through a legal process that would prove just as difficult. Investigators soon interviewed Paige, who described everything she could remember, including taking the bottle of alcohol, going to the party, Matthew repeatedly encouraging Daisy to drink, and another attendee recording part of the night's events on a phone. Detectives then searched for additional evidence, including Daisy's missing phone, which they eventually discovered buried in the snow outside the property. The device contained messages between Daisy and Matthew that helped establish the timeline of the evening. The following day, the boys involved were questioned. Matthew admitted hosting the gathering and inviting the girls, but claimed Daisy had willingly participated in everything that happened. Although he initially denied providing her with alcohol, inconsistencies in his account later led him to acknowledge that he had served her drinks. Even then, he continued insisting that Daisy had been conscious and capable of making decisions. Jordan admitted recording part of the incident and acknowledged showing the video to several friends before deleting it. Another teenager involved cooperated with investigators and provided a detailed statement, which led to immediate legal action against him. However, the cases involving Matthew and Jordan became far more controversial. Critics later argued that investigators appeared to place greater emphasis on the boys' explanations than on Daisy's physical condition and the medical evidence collected at the hospital. Decisions made during the early stages of the investigation, including how certain pieces of evidence were handled, would later become the subject of intense public criticism. One of the most disputed moments came from Daisy's initial interview while she was still hospitalized. She was exhausted, confused, recovering from severe intoxication, and struggling to remember what had happened. During questioning, she gave an uncertain response to one of the officer's questions, a statement that was later interpreted in ways that significantly affected the direction of the investigation. Once Daisy had recovered further, she clarified that she had not fully understood the question at the time and was still disoriented, maintaining that her earlier statement did not reflect what had actually happened. But this single moment became a verbal trap, one that was enough to have the charges against Matthew and Jordan dropped.
Welcome back to The Lead. In other national news, a special prosecutor was announced just a short time ago to look into a rape case in Maryville, Missouri, one that is capturing the nation's attention. Last year, then 14-year-old Daisy Coleman and her 13-year-old friend told authorities 2 teenage boys raped them after a night of drinking. Daisy says she was then dropped outside her house in the freezing snow and found by her mother, Melinda, the next morning. Daisy's alleged rapist was arrested and charged, but those charges were dropped amidst discussions that one of the alleged perpetrators comes from a powerful family in town.
And then another fact came to light. Matthew Barnett's grandfather, a former police officer who had gone on to become a state representative, became involved in the case. The sheriff went as far as to say in court that he didn't consider the girls to be victims at all. In the end, the boys were acquitted and walked free. A justice system meant to protect Daisy instead left her completely alone. Physically, Daisy recovered within a few weeks, but mentally, she was completely shattered. When she returned to school, she hoped life would go back to normal. Instead, what she faced was the exact opposite. Rather than sympathy, she was met with relentless bullying. Most students sided with the popular, good-looking Matthew, calling Daisy and Paige liars and easy girls who supposedly gave themselves up for a bottle of alcohol. Daisy was removed from the school's cheerleading squad. She became an outcast wherever she went. Her brothers tried to stand up for her, but the bullying never stopped. Daisy kept receiving anonymous, abusive, and threatening calls and texts, and her mother received similar messages too. Her closest friend Paige also became a target of bullying and eventually had to transfer schools. The 2 girls who were once inseparable no longer spoke to each other. Slowly, Daisy sank into deep depression. She withdrew from everyone around her, and at one point even attempted to take her own life. It's heartbreaking to think that a 14 or 15-year-old girl who should have been learning to enjoy her life was instead drowning in such isolation and pain. The final blow came when someone set fire to the Coleman family's house. This incident convinced the family that it was no longer safe for them to stay in that town. They decided to move to another state so that Daisy could finish school in a more normal environment. But this story doesn't end here. Years later, a media report brought Daisy's story back into the public eye, and this time, things were about to change. But for Daisy, had that change come too late? A few years later, while Daisy was in college, an influential online publication brought her story back into the spotlight. This time, people from across the country, many of whom had gone through something similar or had been victims of bullying themselves, began speaking up in her support. Soon after, a documentary was made about her story titled Audrey and Daisy, bringing issues of violence, harassment, and bullying into the national conversation. The second central figure in the documentary was a girl named Audrey Pott, who lived in California. Something similar had happened to her, and she too had become an outcast at her school. She sank into a depression she couldn't climb out of, and eventually took her own life. Before she died, she wrote on her social media page that her life felt destroyed and that she no longer saw any reason to keep holding on. It's worth mentioning here, if you or someone you know is going through something like this, please know you don't have to face it alone. Reaching out to a mental health professional is always a sign of strength, not weakness. The documentary and the public support it received gave the Coleman family the courage to fight for justice again and push to have the case reopened.
The national media descending on Maryville, the first physical gathering for protesters after social media fervor, driven by online activist group Anonymous under the hashtag Justice for Daisy.
This is a grassroots effort, and there have been people throughout the entire nation that have been working to try to find some kind of solution and some way to help, and that makes a difference.
Protesters are energizing organizers now that this teen rape case is being reopened. National pressure led to the appointment of a special prosecutor.
This time, Matthew Barnett was formally found guilty, but his sentence was only 4 months of probation, and he paid the victim less than $2,000 in compensation. Compared to the lifelong trauma inflicted on a young girl, both the sentence and the compensation felt like a cruel joke. After graduating college, Daisy decided to start fresh in Colorado. She put her artistic talent to use, taking a job at a tattoo parlor. She was also invited to take part in another documentary project, which she happily agreed to. For a while, it seemed like things were finally starting to look up for her. But fate still had more trials written for this family, and the next one would prove to be the most painful yet. In the summer of 2018, Daisy's mother Melinda and her younger brother Tristan were driving to visit her when they were involved in a car accident. Tristan died on the spot, and Melinda was seriously injured. This tragedy shattered Daisy's already fragile mental state even further. She withdrew into herself again, cutting off contact with almost everyone. On top of this, she learned that she would never be able to have children, a lasting, cruel consequence of the injuries from that night years earlier. Only her work and her creativity kept her going during this time. She poured her pain and fears into her drawings and sketches. But then a new fear crept into her life. She began to feel that a stranger was stalking her. She started receiving threatening, abusive messages again, and worse, this person kept showing up at her house. Daisy went to the police multiple times, telling them about the mysterious stalker and how threatened she felt. But her reports went largely unheard. Around this time, she also discovered that a spare key to her house was missing, and she suspected the stalker may have taken it. On August 4th, 2020, police arrived at Daisy's house after Melinda, unable to reach her daughter, feared the worst and called for a welfare check. Daisy was home and admitted she was very frightened. But police found no signs of an intruder, either inside or around the house, and left shortly after. A few hours later, Daisy video called her boyfriend. She was crying, telling him she couldn't take it anymore. Then she pulled a gun from her desk drawer and took her own life. Her boyfriend immediately alerted emergency services and rushed to her side, but it was too late.
Daisy Coleman has died at the age of 23. Daisy, whose story was featured in the Netflix documentary Audrey and Daisy, has passed away. Her mom, Melinda Coleman, confirmed the news in a Facebook post on Tuesday, August 4th.
Daisy was only 23 years old. Daisy became the third member of her family to die before their time. Her mother, Melinda, never came to terms with the loss. She posted almost daily on social media, remembering her daughter, apologizing to her, saying she wished she could take her pain away and carry it herself. A few months later, at 58 years old, Melinda wrote one final post with an old photo of all her children together. She wrote that she could no longer bear to live with the pain, and, just like her daughter, she took her own life. A family that was once large, loving, and happy was now reduced to just two brothers, Charlie and Logan. When they tried to gather some of their sister's belongings as keepsakes, they discovered that the tattoo salon where she had worked had been robbed, and the albums containing her personal, exclusive sketches had been stolen, as though fate itself wanted to erase even the traces she had left behind. And what became of Matthew Barnett? His life turned out quite successful. He graduated from a prestigious university and, following in his influential grandfather's footsteps, decided to pursue a career in politics. When he learned of the deaths of Daisy and her mother, he offered nothing more than a few dry words of condolence on his social media page. This story leaves us with a painful question. When a justice system fails to protect someone who has been wronged, that person's courage, patience, and ultimately their very life can end up paying the price. The stories of Daisy Coleman and Audrey Pott remind us that the effects of bullying and abuse are never confined to a single moment. They can shape, and sometimes end, a life for years or forever. That was the painful but true story of Daisy Coleman, a story that forces us to reflect on how essential justice and compassion truly are. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next true and gripping story. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'm Alex, and from all of us at Who Was, we'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves.